What's up, .NET developers? Are you curious about or already building your .NET apps in containers and you want to know what's coming out in .NET 8? Well, we're going to do just that in this video. We go over some of the latest things coming to the container world for .NET right here on Learning .NET in C# with Isaac. Hey folks, Isaac Levin here with another edition of What's New in .NET and C#, where I'm going over all sorts of the cool and interesting things that are coming out in .NET 8 and C# 12, all the way up to .NET Conf, which is happening in November of 2023. And if you're liking the videos here, like this .NET content, be sure to comment down below, tell me what you like and what you want to see in future videos. Also, be sure to, subscribe to my channel and share with your friends if you think that they can take advantage of some of the cool stuff that I'm talking about. And one of the things I love talking about with .NET is containers. So if you have had the opportunity to build .NET apps recently, you've probably realized that you can run .NET apps in containers and you can do all sorts of interesting things with them. And whether you're new to containers or you're already building your apps in containers and deploying them all over the place, I hope this video helps, because we're going to be going over some of the key features that are coming out in .NET 8, specifically around the container landscape. So let's just hop right into it. I'm going to share my screen really quick. And as you can see, I'm in my Windows terminal and I'm inside of Windows Subsystem for Linux. So an Ubuntu image or an Ubuntu version running in WSL. We can actually validate what we're doing, what version of Ubuntu we have. So uname-a, and then if I pull up my zoom it, as you can see here, it says Microsoft Standard WSL2, and it has some data information and all of that. Before we get into kind of the nitty gritty of some of the cool things that are coming out in .NET 8, let's actually take a look at some resources that we can look at around, .NET containerization and .NET and Docker in general. So let's actually hop over to a browser where I have the GitHub repository for all of the activity that happens with Docker and .NET and containerization in general. And that is the GitHub repository in the .NET org, and the repository name is .NET-Docker. Inside of here, you can find samples. You can actually look at the Docker images that are used to build some of the different, or the Docker files to create some of the different Docker images that exist for .NET and the ASP.NET runtime, the .NET SDK, and so on and so forth. You can actually, go out to Docker Hub as well, and take a look at, for instance, the SDK and read some information about the feature tags that are supported and different usage and all the different things that you can take a look at from a Docker perspective. And finally, if you want to take a look at, some apps that Microsoft builds actually through this entire tool chain and they run things in production, you can take a look at the .NET Monitor tool, which is out on Microsoft Artifact Registry, which is a tool that Microsoft ships that has that they're using the end-to-end containerization story for. And I'll be sure to provide a link to all of these particular URLs in the link to this video. But let's hop back over to our terminal. So as you can see here, I'm in a particular directory that's I'm mounting from Ubuntu using WSL. So that's a really, really cool thing. Before we get started talking about some of the new things that are coming in .NET for containers, let's actually just talk a little bit holistically about containers and .NET. So if you have built some container or some .NET apps running on containers, you might be familiar that you can run Windows or Linux. We're going to talk specifically of Linux in this video because when we talk about building modern .NET apps, more than likely they're going to be deployed in a Linux environment. So currently, when you build a .NET application and you deploy it to Linux, it runs in more or less 3 different operating systems traditionally. You can run them on different ones as well, or ones that are based off of these ones I'm about to list. But when we talk about OS versions like these ones we're talking about, so those 3 are Debian, they're Ubuntu, and they are Alpine. So each distribution or operating system has its own benefits. So highly recommend taking a look at some of the information about choosing the distribution of choice. So, for instance, if we're building a .NET 7 application today, you can run it on Debian, you can run it on Ubuntu, or you can run it on Alpine, right? Like I mentioned. So, for instance, when we're building .NET 7 applications and we're running a Debian one, for instance, we're using the current version of Debian, which is Debian 11, which is called Bullseye. And Ubuntu, there are versions for that as well as Alpine. And we're going to talk about some of the changes that are coming to the different operating systems or the containers that you can build with those operating systems as a base. So let's actually talk a little bit about where we currently are at with .NET 7. So I'm going to open up Docker Desktop really quick. So Docker Desktop, as you can see here, I have a couple of images already preloaded at the .NET SDK as well as the ASP.NET Runtime. So what I want to do really quick is I want to just showcase what the experience is like when we have these containers on our machines. So what I can actually do, let me just take the SDK and let me just copy that container ID to a clipboard and minimize this out. So what I can do is I can actually spin up a container with that image that I just copied. So let's actually do that really quick. So let's just go Docker run. So we're going to run an image, and then we're going to have -it. So we're going to be connecting into that particular container that we're creating, and I'm going to paste the ID of that particular container image. And then I'm just going to specify what the entry point is for that particular container, which is bash. So we run this. And then what we're going to have, as you can see, we're actually in a container that's being created. And I can actually validate that here if I spin up Docker Desktop. And if I go to my containers, as you can see here, I have a container up and running that's been up and running for about 10 seconds or so. So if I minimize this, I can, do a bunch of different things in the terminal. So like I can do uname-a, for instance, right? And as you can see here, it's all those things. So WSL, GNU Linux, and so on and so forth. And I can actually get information about the operating system. So I could do cat and then etc os release. And this is going to say, as you can see here, this is GNU Debian bullseye, so 11, right? And I can do something like .NET --info. And what this will do is it'll actually show me information about the runtime environment as well as the version of the SDK and the different runtimes installed. So right now this has .NET 7 on it, right? So let's talk about the newer version of .NET 8. So what that's going to actually look like. So let's actually exit out of this. So in .NET 8, let's just clear this out. In .NET 8, we're actually going to be upgrading to the newest version of Debian, which is codenamed Bookworm. So if I go ahead and go back into Docker Desktop, I've already pulled down an image. So if I was to do a search here in my images, and let's just have this be Bookworm. As you can see here, Bookworm Slim, I have the 8.0-preview. This is the specific tag for .NET 8 previews. So I have the SDK and the ASP.NET Runtime. So if I just copy this as well, and then if I open up this back in my console, and then I'm just going to have the same command here, but instead of that ID that I had for that .NET 7 SDK image, I'm going to paste the one for .NET 8 preview. So if I run this, and this is going to, and then I say uname-a. So as you can see, still information about the host, and then I can, same thing, I can get cat etc os-release. And as you can see here, it says GNU Bookworm, right there. So that's the newest version of Debian 12. Which is Debian 12. So let's actually hop back out of here, and then I can do the same thing. I could do .NET -info, and again it shows me that same information. So it says the .NET 8 preview. So at the time of this recording, the newest version of .NET 8 is .NET 8 preview 6, and as you can see here, it's x64 architecture, information about the runtime environment. So it's Debian 12, x64, and then I have the following SDKs and runtimes there. So I'll exit out of this one. So that's Debian. So now let's talk a little bit about some of the changes that are coming to some of the other operating systems for that are Linux operating systems for .NET and containers. So the next one that I'm going to talk about is Alpine. So if you're not familiar with Alpine, Alpine is a Linux distribution that is commonly used for very lightweight scenarios. And one of the things that the .NET team has worked on, with particular to .NET 8 on Alpine, is this idea of composite images. And what a composite image basically is it's a image that's been optimized with new capabilities for ready to run, or R2R configurations. And what this basically does, there are things, some capabilities that you get, a reduction of like JIT compilation time. So that's going to give you better startup performance, and it's going to reduce the size of those R2R images, right? And if you want to take a look at the Docker images for this, we can actually hop over to VS Code, and we can take a look at a particular environment. So let's actually take a look at this one for Alpine. So as you can see, I have Alpine 3.1.8, which is the newest version of Alpine, and then it's the Composite. And this is the GitHub repository that I just showed earlier. I just cloned it, and there's some really good Docker images in here. So let's skip over this stuff here. But basically, the only big difference between Alpine, which is what you see here, and the Alpine Composite is that it's getting a different version of .NET. So it's getting the runtime composite of .NET 8. And if you run that, you're going to have a faster experience, so reduced JIT time and things like that. So that's something that's coming to the latest version of Alpine. And then finally, one thing, and let's just go back into our command line. So one thing as well, so that's 2 of the 3. And the last one, obviously, is Ubuntu. So Ubuntu, there's been a really great story around since .NET 6 even. So .NET 6 chiseled images was introduced by the .NET team and Canonical, which is the maintainers of the Ubuntu Linux distribution. And basically what that provides you is a ton of flexibility around more secure containers. So some of the things that you get with chiseled Ubuntu images is they're really small typically because they don't have the package manager, they don't have a shell, they don't have root, and that just makes for an overall more secure experience as it pertains to being a developer. We can actually drive the point home of what the experience looks like when you have a container that's an Ubuntu chiseled one. So if I go back over to Docker Desktop, I have, if I search for Jammy, I have the ASP.NET Core runtime, and I'm just going to copy this particular ID, and let's just have that run that same command as we did earlier. So Docker run, and then I'm going to take this, so basically the exact same command as earlier, and then I'm going to paste that in there. And if I run this, it's going to give me a different experience. So it does not load, like the container does not run, which is kind of interesting. So, what if I did something like this? So let's just go out of here and let's just go Docker run, and then RM to remove. And then if I specify that particular endpoint again, so again here, and if I do this, it's going to give me no command specified, right? So it's going to show me the .NET information. So it has the .NET SDK. So basically this is the entry point. So basically it shows that .NET is installed on this particular image. So if I try to continue to get into this particular image, it's not going to let me because there is no shell, right? And also there's no root access and there's no package manager. So at the end of the day, it makes our life substantially easier for a development standpoint because our containers, they can, people can't get into them and do nefarious things, which is really cool. And there are a ton of other pieces of information around chiseled images. I'll provide a link in the description to a blog post by Rich on the .NET team who talks about this in detail, as well as just some of the other cool things that are coming out with the chiseled images. So those are the things that are coming to the different base images, the operating systems that we build our .NET apps on. So if you want a Debian flavor host, or for your container, a base operating system for your container, or Ubuntu or Alpine, you have options, and there are some changes coming to each of those. And regardless of which operating system you use, there are some changes going across the board to .NET on containers in general, and I want to talk about those right now. So the most important one is Microsoft is moving to a more least privilege approach for containers. So basically what that means is we want the most secure, most stable containers possible, because we want to have very small attack surface, and we want to have secure containers. So what does that actually mean? So that means that going forward in .NET 8, unless you configure it differently, all of the images out of the box will have a non-root user on them. So what that means is that there's going to be a new user called app, which your application will run as, and things like root access and sudo won't be necessary anymore to run your application. So what does that actually mean in practice? So let's actually just take a look at some examples really quick. Let me just clear this out. So what I want to do really quick is I want to walk through some, basically introduce you to this new app user. So let's actually hop back over to Docker Desktop. And as you can see here, I took away the filter. So I have all of these different Docker images. And let's actually take a look at the base image, which is 8.0-preview. So this is the simplest way to get access to a ASP.NET Core image, right? So let's actually take a look and let's do a Docker run it and see let's see some of the things that we can play around. So let's just do Docker run, and I'm still going to do RM because I'm not going to terminal into it. I just want to get an output and then exit out of the container. And then I'm going to paste that particular ID, and then I just going to run one command. So this is my entry point. So cat, and then in the etc folder, in the passwords folder. And then let's just do something like tail and get like the last line. All right, so what this should do, if I didn't mess something up, is this should actually spin up a version of our container. And if I zoom in here, oops, zoom in, this should give me that cat output. So this is the output of that particular that basically takes the output of the password file that's in the etc directory. And as you can see here, it says app, and then it gives the information about that particular user ID, right? So that's really valuable. So then I can do something a little bit different, right? So I can then do the same thing. So I can then do like a Docker run. Let's just close this out. So I can do Docker run. And then same thing, so RM. And one thing that's been introduced as well as a part of this is you can actually pass a user using the -u argument of the Docker CLI to that image. So we can actually do that right now. So let's just do, and then pass an app. And then I'm going to do the same thing. So specify that particular ID of that particular Docker image. And we're going to do the same thing here. So we're going to provide that particular ID for that container. And then I'm just going to do bash. And then we're going to pass a command into bash. So let's just have that be cd and then pwd, right? So we run this. This is going to spin up that image. It's going to run that particular bash command. And as you can see here, it gives us that home-app directory. So one thing to call out is that that's the directory, that's the user of our home directory, right? So we can close that again. And then like the next thing that we want to potentially be able to do is, we want to make sure that we're following standards that have happened across the industry. So if you look at like Node.js or, Ubuntu or ChainGuard, for instance, like a lot of images are already doing something similar to this. So that's really, really exciting that we're going to be kind of similar across the industry. So when we actually want to use app, right? So I mentioned that you can do the -u in there. So we can validate that, right? So if I was to do like a who am I could do app. So I did that a little bit earlier when I showed the directory, but I can do something similar again. So if I do that, let's just use the same as earlier. And then instead of passing bash in there, I can just do who am I? And this should say app because that is who I am. I am app, right? So right there. So again, these are just simple commands to show like you're running as a specific user. You're not masquerading it as root, but you're showing up in different capacities as a user. So that's, one thing as well is that's doing it via the CLI. If you wanted to do this in a Docker file, you can do something like the user parameter, so user, and then specify the name of that particular user. So if you were to list that out, and then you could pass in that particular UID specifically. And actually the .NET team has shipped like a environment variable in this particular regard. So, it's $app ID, and we can actually take a look at that. If we look at one of our samples here, scroll down a little bit. And as you can see here, there's a user app ID, and we'll actually run this particular sample in a second because there's some other cool things in there as well. But what that's going to do is that's going to make sure that user is always running under that particular app ID, which is really, really valuable. And another thing that's really, really interesting that's kind of it's a blessing that comes with this, non-root experience is that we can't run under the 80 port anymore because the 80 port is a secure port, and we don't have the ability to access that port as a non-root user. So the default port, this is important for ASP.NET Core applications, instead of 80 will be 8080. And we can actually do something in this particular regard to make our life a bit easier. So we'll just have to specify ports when we have Docker files, or when we're doing things using Docker Compose or the Docker CLI. And let's actually take a look at what that looks like. So I'm actually going to need to, instead of just, creating a Docker container off the fly using an image as the base, I actually need to use a Docker file. So I'm going to hop over here to this particular instances here, and let's talk really briefly about some other things that have kind of came about as we move closer and closer with .NET 8 and containers. So one thing that's really important to call out is you can now target multiple platforms using Docker files. So specifically, as you can see here, I have this build platform, and this is actually going to be the platform of the operating system. So here's an example, like maybe you're building an app that needs to be deployed on a Raspberry Pi Linux, but you're building it on a Mac, right? So your platform that you're building on is a bit different than the platform that you're actually going to deploy to. And this is actually really important because more than likely, the applications that you're building are not going to run on a similar infrastructure, right? They're going to be a bit different. So this actually makes our lives a bit more stable as it pertains to being able to configure that. So, and you can do this for a bunch of different opportunities or a bunch of different configurations. So let's just look at that. Before we take a look at this particular demo, let's actually take a look at what this looks like. So let's just do a Docker build, and then we're going to specify, just give it a tag, the name of our app, and then we're going to specify a platform. And that platform is Linux /ARM64, and then I'm going to specify a different Docker file. So the Docker file that I want to use is Docker file, and then it is, I believe it is called Alpine. Let me just validate. Docker file.alpine-non-root. So .alpine /non-root. So when I run this, this is actually going to build out that particular image for this particular application. So if we take a look at this image, as you can see here, we're using a platform. So I'm passing in that platform command. So ARM64 is what I passed in. And then I'm using the Alpine preview. And then it goes through the process, as you can see here. And then down here, we're using that user app ID. So when this is all said and done, when we run our application, it's going to, it's a container that's built for a particular architecture, and it is a non-root user running application. So when this is done, we'll hop back and take a look at what the result looks like. All right, so we're done. So it's finished running. So we can actually, let's just clear all this out. And then I can do, so I just did that Docker build. So then I can do Docker run -rm and /d and specify the port. And the port in this case, 8,000. So let's just have the port be 8,000. And then, sorry, the app tag. So before I run this, let's actually take a look at what this looks like in Docker Desktop. So open up Docker Desktop, and as you can see, we have an app tag, and that app, as you can see, it is an ARM64 image. So we were able to pass a platform into it, and it specifies that. So if we hop back over to the CLI and I run this, we're going to get an error message, or not an error message, a warning message that's actually quite interesting. So it says the requested image is platform, ARM64 does not match the detected host platform, and no specific platform was requested. So that's really interesting. So if we hop back over to Docker Desktop and we take a look at our containers, as you can see, we have an ARM64 container running, right? And it's using the app there. So we can actually do something like, let's just curl http localhost 8,000, and then the environment endpoint, because we're using this particular application, there's an environment endpoint that we can hit to get information about the container's environment. So if we run this curl command here, this will actually return some information about the operating system. So as you can see, .NET 8 Preview 6, Alpine Linux 3.18, ARM64, the user's app, right? So all that information that we were talking about a bit earlier, right, it's all right there. So that's really valuable for us as we're building out our applications. And, one thing that's also really interesting about this as well is that this application, we don't have that root access that we might be traditionally familiar with. So let's actually do this. Let me get out of here, And then we get back into Docker Desktop. Open up Docker Desktop. I close it on accident, so now I got to bring it over to a different window. So as you can see here, I have this particular container running. So let's do something that I might have been able to do in the past with previous .NET containers. So let's just do docker exec, and then I'm going to pass in that particular ID, and then I want to run a particular command against it. So in this particular case, I know that there is an app settings file in there. So let's just remove our app settings .json file. Right. So if I run that, I get a permission denied. Right. If I was running this with a different container that had root access, it would delete that file. Right. So that's not good. And what if I want to do something similar? So let's just use the same thing. So instead of doing that, let's just do apk add curl. So like I want to install an application or a package inside of this particular container. So if I run this, I get a permission denied as well. So that's really, really good because I don't have the ability to do some of these things. However, I do have the ability to elevate to root. So I could do the same thing that I did earlier. So let's just do apk add curl. So inside of my docker exec, I can then specify the user, and then specify root. And then what that will actually do, as you can see, this is actually, I terminaled into my container and I was able to install the curl package because I specified the user as root. So that's just another thing that, we do have the flexibility to get to that root level if we need to in particular cases. And I know what you're probably thinking, like, oh, like -u root, that's kind of scary. But I mean, well, if somebody is able to get to this point where they can actually run Docker commands against containers that you have running in an environment, you probably have way more issues than your app being taken down. Like people have access to your host system, which is not ideal for a lot of reasons. So, those are a ton of different things that are going on in the container space. And I'm excited because it just means that as a .NET developer, I have more options to build applications, right? So, I no longer have to worry about root access inside of my containers. I have the configuration ability to specify different platforms that I want to deploy, build my containers against, even if they're ones that aren't my machine. So there's some really, really cool things coming out in the .NET space. And I hope you like this video. If you do, be sure to comment down below. Let me know if you like this video or what other sort of .NET content you want to see as we get closer and closer to .NET Conf. And be sure to subscribe to my channel, share it with your friends, and I hope you're building amazing .NET apps using containers. So that's it for today. Take care.